This story begins where the American dream meets its shadow, in the stark contrast between the glittering skylines of promise and the silent suffering behind detention center walls. It's the story of Zohran Mamdani, whose journey from immigrant child to political force would expose the hidden cruelty of America's immigration system and challenge the very conscience of a nation. To truly understand the man Zohran would become, we must first meet the child he was. Picture a 7-year-old boy, small brown hands clutching his mother's as they stepped out of JFK Airport into the overwhelming sensory explosion of 1990s Queens. The air itself was a tapestry of scents: sizzling street meat from halal carts, exhaust fumes from the chronically gridlocked Van Wyck Expressway, the sweet yeasty promise of fresh bread from a Dominican bakery. Sounds cascaded from every direction: the rattling crescendo of the 7 train emerging from underground, rapid-fire Spanish from fruit vendors arranging their colorful pyramids, the melodic lilt of Bengali from garment workers heading home, the sharp staccato of Korean from shopkeepers rolling up their security gates. This vibrant, chaotic mosaic became young Zohran's new world. But beneath the surface of this multicultural paradise hummed a constant, low-frequency fear that every immigrant family recognized. He learned the unspoken rules quickly. You don't draw attention. You work twice as hard for half as much. You keep your head down and your documents closer. He saw how his parents would tense at any official-looking letter in the mail, how they'd meticulously double-check every form until their hands shook. He noticed how neighbors would suddenly fall silent when police cars cruised by, how the lively banter in the bodega would evaporate when certain government vehicles appeared. This duality, the brilliant, chaotic promise of New York against its dark, systemic underbelly, would forge the activist he would become. The political awakening didn't happen in a university lecture hall, but in the airless, overcrowded living rooms of tenants facing eviction. As a young housing advocate, Zohran didn't just see cases, he entered the final, desperate acts of family tragedies. He would sit on couches stained with children's tears, the air thick with the smell of anxiety and cheap coffee. There was Maria, a grandmother from Guatemala who had survived death squads only to face a slumlord who shut off her heat in January. She wasn't just fighting for an apartment. She was fighting for the small altar to the Virgin she had built in the corner, the one sacred piece of home she had managed to carry across borders. There was Ahmed, a Yemeni bodega owner whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of lifting crates, now trembling as he held an eviction notice he couldn't fully read, his limited English failing him in his moment of greatest need. These weren't abstract housing issues to Zohran. They were human beings at the cliff's edge. And increasingly, the push that threatened to send them over wasn't just a greedy landlord, it was the ever-present threat of ICE. He would never forget holding the small, warm hand of 8-year-old Sophia, an American citizen who whispered to him, "If we call the landlord about the rats, will he call the men who take people away? I don't want them to take my puppy." In that moment, Zohran understood that his fight for housing was inseparable from the fight for the right to simply exist, to be visible without fear. When he was elected to the New York State Assembly, it wasn't an endpoint, but the acquisition of a weapon he would sharpen for a single purpose. He stood before the press corps not on the steps of some grand capitol, but in a community center in Jackson Heights, surrounded by the very faces the system had tried to erase. The room was a living mosaic of human resilience. "My message to ICE agents," he declared, his voice cutting through the buzz of camera shutters, "is that you will be held to the same standard of law that you so eagerly enforce against others. If you break the law, if you violate the basic human rights of anyone in this city, you will be held accountable." The applause was thunderous, but it was the silent, tearful nods from the mothers in the back, women who knew the price of fear, that truly fueled him. This wasn't a soundbite, it was a declaration of war on what he would come to call the architecture of cruelty. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. The call didn't go to his official office line, but to a trusted aide's personal cell phone. The voice on the other end was hushed, cracking with a mixture of fear and conviction. The caller was Mark, who had spent 2 years as a guard at the Blackwater Correctional Facility. a for-profit detention center in upstate New York that had a lucrative contract with ICE. Mark was no radical. He was a former Marine from a conservative family in rural Pennsylvania who took the job to support his wife and newborn daughter. But what he witnessed day after day systematically broke down his moral defenses. He spoke of a profit per diem model where the parent company's stock price literally ticked up with every bed filled, creating a perverse incentive to detain, to deny, to delay. He described the dehumanizing language used in training. Immigrants were units, their complaints were management issues, their medical emergencies were liability concerns. He provided a digital trove of evidence that went far beyond dry reports. There were scanned copies of handwritten logs with frantic notes scribbled in the margins by concerned guards later overruled by supervisors. There were internal emails where high-level administrators dismissed medical complaints as malingering and seeking amenities. Most damningly, there were cell phone videos, shaky and grainy but unmistakable, showing detainees being served maggot-ridden food, others showing overflowing toilets that hadn't been repaired for weeks, and one particularly chilling clip showing a man having a seizure while guards stood by arguing about protocol. But among the thousands of pages, one name emerged with haunting frequency: Carlos. Carlos was a bakery worker from a small town in the Ecuadorian Andes, a man whose life had been built around the warmth of ovens and the simple satisfaction of feeding people. He wasn't a criminal. He was a father who had overstayed a visa to pay for his daughter's life-saving asthma medication, treatments his wages back home could never cover. According to the official logs, Carlos was a model detainee, but Mark's testimony painted the true picture. Carlos, a man whose soul was nurtured by community and shared meals, had initiated a peaceful hunger strike to protest the freezing temperatures in his cell block and the rotten food. In response, he was thrown into solitary confinement, a concrete box where the lights never went out and time lost all meaning. The official record stated he was there for inciting unrest. The truth, Mark confessed, was that he was being broken for his defiance. When Carlos's health deteriorated, when his persistent cough turned into a racking, bloody gasp, his pleas for a doctor were logged as "inmate is requesting amenities." For 3 agonizing days, the request went unanswered. By the time a nurse finally saw him, pneumonia had settled deep in his lungs. He was literally hours from death. Zohran now faced his defining crucible. He held in his hands the power to create a media explosion that would dominate headlines for days. He could go public with the entire trove, naming Carlos, showcasing the videos, shaming the corporation on national television. It would be a spectacular short-term victory, cementing his reputation as a fearless reformer. But he knew the news cycle was a ravenous beast. It would consume the story and move on, leaving wreckage in its wake. Carlos would be branded a troublemaker, his asylum claim fast-tracked for denial, and he would be deported back to the very circumstances he had fled, likely permanently separated from his family. The private prison corporation would issue carefully worded apologies, maybe fire a few low-level employees, and continue business as usual. The other path was far more dangerous, a high-stakes legal and political gambit with no guarantee of success. He could use the evidence not for public spectacle but for a precise surgical strike. He could leverage his position to force the system to see Carlos not as a case number but as a human being, a father, a baker, a man dying for a principle in a concrete box. After a sleepless night pacing his apartment, watching the sunrise paint the Manhattan skyline in hues of orange and pink, Zohran made his choice. He chose Carlos. What followed was a masterclass in coordinated pressure that would become the model for his future advocacy. His legal team, working through the night, filed an emergency injunction, arguing that Carlos's treatment constituted torture under international law and that deporting him would effectively be a death sentence given his fragile health. Simultaneously, his grassroots organizers activated a sophisticated network of allies. The hashtag Save Carlos campaign was born, not as a vague hashtag, but as a targeted weapon. They flooded the detention center's warden with phone calls that came in relentless waves. They organized candlelight vigils outside the corporate headquarters of the detention center's parent company, their silent figures holding flickering flames, a stark contrast to the cold, gleaming skyscraper. Most powerfully, they found Carlos's family in Queens, his wife Elena, who worked cleaning offices overnight, and his two daughters, Jessica and Liliana. With their permission, they made them the face of the fight. A photograph of the two girls holding a framed picture of their father from his bakery days, his face flour-dusted and beaming, appeared on the front page of local papers. Their quiet dignity proved more powerful than any protest sign. And Zohran? He took the fight to the chamber of the state assembly, but he didn't speak in the dry legalese of policy. Instead, he held up the photo of Carlos and his daughters. He described the smell of fresh bread that had once clung to Carlos's clothes. He read from Mark's testimony about the bloody cough echoing in the solitary cell. "We are funding this," he roared, his voice trembling not with weakness but with a fury refined by grief. "Our tax dollars are paying for this torture. We are being made complicit in the destruction of a family, in the very antithesis of what this country claims to stand for. This man is not a threat. He is a testament to our failure." The pressure became an inescapable vortex. The judge, confronted with both the brutal evidence and the overwhelming public outcry, granted the stay of deportation. The order cited egregious violations of basic human dignity and a profound failure of due process. Carlos was transferred to a public hospital where he spent 2 weeks recovering and was later released on bond. The moment he walked out, frail and leaning on his wife's arm, into the stunned silence of a bright New York afternoon, was not a moment of political triumph but of profound, heartbreaking relief. It wasn't freedom. The legal cloud still hung over him, his case still pending, but it was a return to the fight, armed now with something he had nearly lost: hope. The story of Zohran Mamdani is ultimately a map of transformation, of an immigrant child who learned the grammar of fear and is now writing a new language of courage. He was forged in the intimate spaces of personal crisis and now battles on the grand stage of systemic injustice. The machinery of ICE, that Goliath of bureaucracy and profit, remains largely intact. But Zohran Mamdani has proven that it is not invincible. He has shown that a slingshot, if aimed with truth and propelled by the collective will of the people, can still find its mark. His journey forces upon us a searing moral reckoning. The true character of a society is not revealed in its monuments or stock markets, but in its darkest corners, in the cold concrete cells where it hides its inconvenient truths. The detention centers are a mirror held up to America's soul. Do we see a nation that enforces its laws with calibrated cruelty, that hides its sins in red tape and corporate contracts? Or do we see a nation still capable of moral outrage, that still believes justice must be tempered with mercy, that the measure of our progress is etched in how we treat the most vulnerable among us? If this story has stirred something within you, that flicker of anger at injustice, that spark of hope at resistance, that profound unease at our collective complicity, then you have already crossed the most important border. That feeling is the most powerful weapon we have. Do not let it fade. Subscribe to the Border Archives. Share this story. Because here we refuse to reduce human beings to statistics. We bear witness to the lives behind the numbers. We are the guardians of the stories that cross borders, and in doing so, cross into our own hearts. Join us. The archive is vast, and every story is another battle for the soul of a nation.